Sections from 1 Samuel. There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah and the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. When they were visiting in Shiloh at the temple, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. Hannah made this vow: O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and do not forget your servant, but give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. In due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh and said, I am the woman who prayed for a child, and God has been good to me. So I come bringing my son Samuel to give to the Lord as long as he lives. Hannah prayed, saying, My heart exults in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in my victory. There is no Holy One like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meal was boiling, with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up by the priest would take for himself. Now Eli was very old. He had heard that his sons were... Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel. And the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. One evening Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was, when the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel. And the boy said, Here I am. He ran to Eli, saying, Here I am, you called me. But Eli said, I did not call you. Lie down again. 3 times it happened that the Lord called, and Samuel went to Eli to offer himself for service. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am going to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his sons, and will punish his house forever. Samuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli insisted, and Samuel told Eli that his house would be punished. Eli said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground.
In today's story, things open up on a big heaping mess. No, not just Hannah's mess, which is big in its own right. After all, not only is she struggling to conceive, but because of it, her husband's second wife, who the text refers to as her rival, has been mocking her severely for years. And later in the story, Hannah will mention that she's been vindicated over all of her enemies, which confirms what we might have assumed about her time and place, that she's become a social pariah with everyone. But the big heaping mess that today's story opens up onto is not just this. Today's story opens up onto the big heaping mess that God's people as a whole are drowning in. You see, 1 Samuel begins right where the book of Judges has left off. The book of Judges, which tells us how, after living in the promised land for a while, God's people are living in a mess. God's people are a mess. Politically, economically, socially, spiritually, morally, a big heaping mess. Biblical scholar Alphanetta Wines pulls no punches in her summary of the ending of the book of Judges. She writes, as 1 Samuel opens, things could not be worse for Israel. Judges, the previous book, ended with the community in chaos. Micah establishes an alternative system of worship. The Danites take over a peaceful town, steal Micah's gods and priest, and adopt his religion for themselves. The brutal rape and abuse of one woman by some Benjamite men leads to civil war that nearly wipes out the tribe of Benjamin. Then the community preserves the tribe of Benjamin by abducting and committing similar violence against 2 communities of women, 600 in all. No, she concludes, things could not get worse. And the first three chapters of 1 Samuel remind us that it is picking up in the midst of the mess that Judges left off on by introducing us to Eli's sons, who are serving as priests who use their position to live better than those they serve, and who continue to take advantage of vulnerable women. And so here, at the beginning of 1 Samuel, in the middle of this big heaping mess and all it has done to all of these vulnerable women, the ugly momentum of that mess is suddenly interrupted with this very humanizing story of one human, humble woman, Hannah. Eventually, the story will depict Samuel, to some degree Saul, and definitely David, all big men, as the major players in God fixing Israel's mess. But for now, because perhaps it couldn't or shouldn't be any other way, it's the everyday woman Hannah, and Hannah only, who God cuts through the mess with, whose faithfulness sets everything in motion for God's people to leave their mess behind and start over. Because Hannah, whose mess is her own personal version of all of Israel's mess, does something very simple but also courageous. She waits and prays for a child. Now, maybe you're wondering why I would praise her waiting. I mean, of course she waits, right? What else is she supposed to do? But remember, if we're hearing this story as those who have been raised on the stories of Sarah, Rachel, and Leah, we should be expecting things to go differently. We should have been trained by Scripture to expect a pattern to continue here, the pattern of a couple who are unable to bear a child turning to a surrogate mother to solve their problem. But Hannah interrupts that pattern. Hannah actually waits and prays. And when she prays, she doesn't just pray meekly, she prays honestly. She weeps bitterly before God. She tells God, look at my misery and remember me. And then, after having waited patiently and prayed honestly, she makes the faithful promise that has to be one of the hardest promises for any parent to make. But surely even more so for a parent who's longed for a child for so long. She promises that if God gives her this child, she will allow her child to fully follow God's calling, even though, in her case, the calling she already sees coming will require her to let go of her child. So it is that Hannah has Samuel, and God's new beginning for all of God's people, God's work to lift them out of their big heaping mess, is off and running. Now, this might seem like a bit of a stretch, the suggestion that this one mother and her one child are somehow holding the future of their entire people. And if you want, you and I can doubt that, but Hannah didn't. When her child is finally born, Hannah prays, and her prayer should sound familiar because her prayer is her version of the song that God's people sing together across time in God's story. Through her prayer, Hannah sings. Because do you hear it? Hannah picks up the tune that was sung by God's people on the banks of the Red Sea after God brought them up out of slavery and into freedom. Hannah has continued the tune that Mary will pick up when she finds out that she'll be giving birth to Jesus, who will change everything. It's a song that God's people, when they're getting it right, sing when God is doing something new, when God is cleaning up their big heaping messes and offering them a new future. It's a song that sings of God overthrowing all the mess and the oppression and the exploitation of the way things are and have been. It's a song that sings of God tearing down the tyrants and raising up the vulnerable. And more than anything, it's the song that we call doxology, a song that simply says, all of this, God, every good thing is because of you, God. And so we declare that. We declare that it's all because of you. Then, having prayed with the choir of God's people across all of time, Hannah takes Samuel to Eli, hands him over to the calling she has discerned for him, and Samuel begins his life as priest, Eli's apprentice. And so it is that the most famous part of the story then unfolds. Samuel, lying in the temple at night, hears a voice calling to him. Samuel says, "Here I am." He runs to Eli's room and he says, "Here I am." But Eli says, "I didn't call you. You can go lie down again." So Samuel does. And yet again, he hears a voice calling his name more forcefully, "Samuel." So he goes to Eli again and says, "Here I am. You called for me." And Eli says, "No, you can go lie back down." And then it all happens again. But now Eli says, "Okay, Samuel, it's not me calling. So the next time you hear that voice, just say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel goes and lies back down. This time he hears, "Samuel, Samuel." And this time Samuel says, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And God now replies, "I'm about to do something that will make everyone's ears tingle when they hear about it. I'm about to end the ugliness. I'm about to break it off at its source. I'm about to end this mess and do something new." And so Samuel lies there until morning, tossing and turning with the news. Ultimately, it's life-giving news for God's people, but for Eli's sons who've been perpetuating this mess, indulging in the mess, rubbing other people's faces in the mess for their own gain, it's inevitably bad news. And so Samuel lies there, wondering what he will say to Eli in the morning. And in the morning, Eli asks Samuel, "What did God say?" Samuel's hesitant, but Eli says, "Tell me." And so Samuel tells him everything, and Eli says, "Okay, what is good in God's eyes, let God do." And then, just like that, the story moves on from Eli and his sons, and the story of Samuel and who Samuel becomes and where Samuel goes turns to who Israel becomes and where Israel goes. In other words, God's new start for God's people has begun. This future will not be perfect. It will come almost immediately with its own failings, imperfections, and muddy moments. And the new beginning is often later going to be referred to as arriving with King David, but make no mistake, it is here that the new beginning was conceived and being born. It is here that that big heaping mess could finally begin to be left behind, and God's new beginning breaks through the darkness. And it's a new beginning that was allowed to break through because of 4 human yeses. You see, when God in God's mercy, grace, and love wanted to offer God's people a way out of their mess and a new beginning, God chose, as God does, to work with us humans. God took the risk of working with us, meaning that God's plan, in order to come to fruition, used 4 very human yeses, so that God's new beginning for God's people could break through. And those 4 human yeses were these. First, Hannah said yes to patient waiting and honest prayer. Hannah didn't rush to cover up her pain with quick fixes or denial. Instead, Hannah was honest with God while doing things the right way, even when the right way was slow. Second, Hannah said yes to an invitation to join all of Israel in their doxology, their song that sang, "God, I recognize you as the giver of all good things." Now, this may seem like a curious song. To us today, it can make God sound vain, maybe, as if God wants us to tell God what God already knows. Or it can sound like superstition, as if we think it's about saying this magic formula so that God will do what we ask. But doxology, recognizing that God is the giver of all good things, is much more than that. Doxology is the offer of unlimited possibilities and true freedom. Because the truth is, when we've been living in a big heaping mess, like God's people were by the end of the book of Judges, like God's people were when they were enslaved in Egypt, like so many of us are today because of our world's exploitative systems of oppression. It's not just that we have to live in that mess, it's that the mess, well, excuse the pun, also messes with our minds. It limits what we can imagine is possible. And the way to see beyond the mess is to see that there is one who exists beyond the mess. One beyond the narrow possibilities that the mess holds us to and tells us we're limited to. One beyond and above the earthly powers who claim that we could never have it any other way. And it's by singing and praying, and if need be, just whispering, that there is one above it all and beyond it all, one that is greater than all the powers that keep us trapped in our mess, that we free ourselves from the thinking imposed on us by our mess. And we open ourselves to the possibilities of the infinite and unlimited good. So those are Hannah's 2 yeses, the second of which joins her together with God's people recurring, and their recurring yes across all of time. 2 yeses that allow God what God is trying to do to move God's people from their big heaping mess into something new. There's also a third and a fourth yes that allow God's work to break through in this story. Because third, Samuel says yes. Samuel makes himself open to hearing God's voice. In this particular story, it's not necessarily a voice that can be immediately located or recognized for what it is, but it's a voice that, through Samuel's persistent openness to it, eventually breaks through. And because time after time, Samuel says, yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm listening. Eventually, the necessary message breaks through. Fourth, God's new beginning is allowed to break through because Eli says yes to God's invitation to yield his power. Now, let's be clear. The text doesn't really indicate that Eli had a choice. It would seem that at this point, whether or not Eli recognizes that his family's time in power is up, and whether or not Eli is willing to give it up, God is going to end the mess and break open a new beginning. But it's worth noting that Eli does yield. It's worth noting that sometimes saying yes to God's plan means saying yes to yielding power, releasing privilege, stepping aside so that the oppressive system we're a part of perpetuating can be replaced as quickly as possible. So, today, I firstly invite you to ask yourself, where do you see yourself stuck in a mess? Do you recognize the global messes that we're all stuck in together, messes like climate change and this continuing pandemic? Do you recognize the national messes that we're stuck in together, messes like racial inequality and deep political polarization? Are you feeling stuck in a mess with friends or family, stuck facing issues or relationship patterns that seem all covered in muck? Are you, like Hannah, feeling caught up in a deeply personal mess, something very specific, maybe even private to you? Whichever one of those messes or potential messes jumps out at you today, and I invite you to just pick one of them right now. There will be other days to think about the other ones, and I think we're only built to worry about one mess at a time. I want to close by inviting you to ask yourself, which yes or yeses is God calling you to say today in order to allow God to move you or all of us closer to a new beginning? Is it Hannah's yes, to waiting patiently while also praying honestly? If so, may God give you strong knees, a bold voice, and good people to hold you up. Is it Israel's yes to singing praise God from whom all blessings flow? If so, may God give you the voice to join the choir and the liberated mind to imagine the previously unimaginable. Is it Samuel's yes to simply being open and available for whatever God is throwing at you? If so, may God give good ears, persistent spirit, and open hands. Or is it Eli's yes to yielding power and privilege? If so, may God give you a humble spirit, a brave heart, and the opportunity to learn from those who may have other ways of doing things. All of which is to say, when you pray about your messes, when you pray about our collective messes, may God help you to see where you have the incredible opportunity to help open up a new beginning. May God show you where it is that you have the chance to say yes.